The morning sun reflected off the massive windows of the Mendoza mansion, creating a light show that Arthur completely ignored. The young millionaire sat in his luxurious leather armchair, staring absently into the sprawling garden while mindlessly twirling the crystal glass in his hand. Neither the expensive drink nor the magnificent surroundings could bring him satisfaction. Helena, the housekeeper who had been with him since childhood, entered the room. "Sir Arthur, your parents are on the phone," she said in a soft voice that betrayed both affection and concern. Helena knew that despite his luxurious lifestyle, Arthur often felt lonely. His wealth had alienated him from others, and his parents were constantly preoccupied with business obligations. "We called to let you know that we won't be able to come for your birthday next week," his mother Marina explained bluntly. "A fantastic business opportunity has come up in Asia. We're doing all of this for your future," his father Francisco added. "We'll transfer extra money so you can celebrate however you like." Arthur's jaw tightened. He set the glass down, stood up abruptly, and muttered, "They think they can buy everything with money." Shortly after, he left the house and drove to the stables, where his friend Ricardo was waiting. "Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this." "There you are, finally," Ricardo called out, holding a glass in his hand. "I thought you weren't coming. You missed the qualifying race. My new thoroughbred took first place, of course." Arthur forced a smile and nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. A conflict between pride and frustration raged in his mind. He hated not being the center of attention, and the thought of being outshone by Ricardo gnawed at his ego. "I heard there's a new horse here," Arthur said finally, trying to distract himself from his insecurity. The two friends strolled over to the sales area, where Arthur caught his breath. In front of him stood Thunder, a magnificent black thoroughbred with a small white spot on its chest. The horse's muscular build and elegant posture drew everyone's attention. Fascinated by the majestic aura of the horse, Arthur impulsively decided to buy it. As the paperwork was being signed, he proudly posed for photos while Thunder observed his new owner with a mix of curiosity and concern. Without considering the horse's needs, Arthur immediately planned his first race. He ordered the stable master to train Thunder hard, despite Miguel, the experienced caretaker, warning him, "The horse needs time to adjust. Too much training could harm it." Arthur dismissed the concern. "The race is in 3 weeks. He needs to be fit." The men around him looked down uncomfortably, but no one dared to question Arthur's orders. Thunder began to suffer under the strain, losing weight and the sparkle in his eyes. Miguel watched with growing concern, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. On race day, the atmosphere was tense. The prestigious hippodrome was filled with high society members chatting and drinking champagne. Arthur circulated among the guests, his smile forced and his nerves hidden behind excessive alcohol consumption. When the race began, Thunder shot out of the gate like an arrow, but soon his movements became uncoordinated and sluggish. The horse lost speed, stumbled, and finally collapsed. A horrified silence fell over the spectators before murmurs of disappointment and ridicule began to spread. Arthur felt shame burning within him like fire. The veterinarians rushed over and delivered a bitter diagnosis: exhaustion and malnutrition due to overtraining. As the rain poured down on the hippodrome, Arthur began to devise a desperate plan born of anger and wounded pride. That same night, drunk and frustrated, he had the weakened Thunder dragged to his yacht. "Let him drift out to sea," he ordered with a cold gaze while his friends remained silent. The drunken group didn't notice a small fishing boat nearby. Joan, an experienced fisherman, recognized the danger and acted quickly. As Thunder struggled for his life, Joan managed to secure him with a rope and slowly pull him to the boat. The yacht carrying Arthur and his friends disappeared into the darkness, while Joan and Thunder reached the safety of the shore. The scandal spread like wildfire. Videos of the cruel act went viral, and public outrage grew. Francisco, Arthur's father, learned of the disgrace during a business trip and returned immediately. Joan and Miguel cared for Thunder with love and dedication, though the horse's physical and emotional wounds healed slowly. While Thunder began to find new hope, Arthur faced the ruins of his former life, unaware that his journey toward remorse and self-awareness had only just begun. News of Thunder's rescue and Arthur's cruel acts spread rapidly. Videos and images of Arthur's furious face and the horse's desperate struggle in the water circulated everywhere. Social media exploded with outrage, and the media eagerly picked up the story. Heir to the Mendoza dynasty attempts to drown valuable thoroughbred, read the headlines. Arthur barricaded himself in his room, closing the blinds and turning off his phone. On his laptop, he saw the comments and hateful messages pouring in by the second. Even friends who had once admired him now turned their backs. Ricardo and others from his clique no longer responded to his messages, as if they wanted to sever all ties with him. The silence was suffocating, and for the first time Arthur felt loneliness so painfully that it physically hurt him. The next morning, Francisco arrived at the mansion. His face was stern, his eyes narrowed with disappointment and anger. Arthur swallowed hard as his father entered the room. "What were you thinking?" Francisco asked, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "It was a mistake. Arthur began, but Francisco cut him off. "You've not only tarnished your reputation, but also our family name. Worse, you nearly killed a defenseless animal. Your arrogance and selfishness have brought this chaos upon you." Arthur stood motionless, his shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," he said. "Sorry?" Francisco laughed bitterly. "Remorse is worthless without change. I should have intervened sooner, but I wanted to give you the freedom to learn and take responsibility. Instead, you've crossed every line. Now you'll face the consequences." "What do you mean?" Arthur asked quietly. "From now on, your accounts are frozen. You won't see a single cent from me. The mansion is closed, and you'll work at the stables. Not as an owner, but as a stable hand. You'll learn what it means to take responsibility and stand up for your actions." Arthur wanted to protest, but a look at his father's face silenced him. Francisco left the room without another word. Hours later, Arthur packed a small bag and headed to the stables, where Miguel awaited him with crossed arms and a stern expression. "Good morning, sir," Miguel said with a mix of respect and severity. "From today, you're no longer the heir to the Mendoza family, but a stable hand like everyone else. Change your clothes and report to me in the stable." Arthur's cheeks burned with shame. For the first time in his life, he had to do physical labor, mucking out stalls, preparing feed, and tending to the animals. His hands, once accustomed to fine fabrics, soon ached and blistered from the unfamiliar work. Miguel watched him critically, but helped when necessary. At first, Arthur grumbled and tried to avoid the work, but Miguel allowed no excuses. "If you want to work here, do it properly," he admonished sternly. Gradually, Arthur began to see things differently, especially Thunder, who was slowly recovering from his injuries. The sight of the weakened horse filled him with guilt and regret. One night, unable to sleep, Arthur went to the stable where Thunder rested in his stall. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Thunder lifted his head and looked at him. No anger, just a quiet, knowing sadness. Arthur felt tears welling up and sat down on the floor, overwhelmed by his emotions. The next morning, Miguel found him there, asleep with his head leaning against the stall. Without a word, he woke Arthur and handed him a shovel. "Get up, work awaits." Over time, the other workers noticed a change in Arthur. He worked longer and harder, listened to the advice of the experienced hands, and showed genuine interest in caring for the horses. Thunder also began to warm up to him. One day, Arthur dared to reach out his hand, and Thunder sniffed it, as if getting to know him anew. These small steps gave Arthur hope and sparked a desire to prove himself. He began to take responsibility, caring not only for Thunder, but also for the other horses. Miguel's critical gaze gradually turned to nods of approval, and even Helena, who visited the stables regularly, noticed the change in him. But Arthur knew the path to forgiveness was long. Not just the forgiveness of others, but the forgiveness he needed to grant himself. Weeks passed, and Arthur grew accustomed to the hard work at the stables. His body grew stronger, his hands calloused, and his attitude noticeably shifted. Instead of giving orders, he listened and learned. He began to see the horses not as status symbols, but as living beings with feelings and needs. Miguel observed the change with quiet satisfaction. One morning, as the sun's rays illuminated the stables, he noticed Arthur, who had already risen early to clean the stalls and prepare feed. "You're quite diligent," Miguel remarked dryly. Arthur wiped the sweat from his brow and shrugged. "There's a lot to do." True, Miguel said, leaning against the stable door. You know, young man, I never thought you'd make it this far. But sometimes you have to start from the bottom to realize what truly matters. Arthur nodded silently, thinking of Thunder. The stallion was slowly recovering but still showed signs of mistrust and hesitation. Despite Arthur's efforts, a certain distance remained between them. One afternoon, Joan, the old fisherman, visited. He had become a sort of mentor to Arthur, and the two often sat together talking about life. You've changed, Joan observed, holding an old pipe. Sometimes I wonder if it's enough, Arthur replied thoughtfully. Thunder still doesn't trust me, and I can't blame him. Joan placed a hand on his shoulder. Trust isn't regained overnight. It's like the sea. You can't control it, only learn to navigate it. Give it time. The next day, Arthur received a surprise. Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian, arrived with good news. Thunder is making great progress. His physical injuries are almost fully healed. Now it's about overcoming the emotional trauma. Can I work with him? Arthur asked hesitantly. The vet scrutinized him, then nodded. But be gentle. Trust is fragile. Arthur spent the following days cautiously approaching Thunder. At first, he kept his distance, speaking softly and telling the horse stories about his work and thoughts. Thunder occasionally lifted his head, listening but remaining wary. After a week, Arthur dared to reach out his hand. Thunder sniffed cautiously and finally allowed a tentative touch. A wave of relief and joy washed over Arthur as Thunder no longer shied away. Miguel, who had been watching from a distance, nodded in satisfaction and smiled. Even Helena, standing nearby, discreetly wiped a tear from her eye. News of Arthur's progress and his new attitude slowly spread. Even Francisco, still hesitant to approach his son, heard about the changes. One evening, as the sun set and bathed the pastures in golden light, Francisco visited the stables. I've heard you're doing well, he said without looking directly at Arthur. I'm trying, Arthur replied quietly, pausing before adding, I have a lot to make up for and a lot to set right. Francisco sighed deeply and finally looked at his son. I spoiled you and never set boundaries. Maybe I share some blame for how you turned out. But I'm glad you're finally taking responsibility. A tentative smile appeared on Arthur's face. I want to do better, Father, for Thunder and for myself. Francisco nodded and left him with a firm pat on the shoulder. For the first time in a long while, Arthur felt a warm sense of hope. The following weeks were marked by hard work and patience. Arthur established a routine that gave him structure. Thunder also continued to recover, feeling safer in Arthur's presence. Their relationship developed slowly but steadily. Finally, the day came when Thunder ate from Arthur's hand, a small but significant moment that filled Arthur's heart with gratitude. During this time, the idea emerged to transform the stables into a center for abused and traumatized horses. Francisco and Miguel wholeheartedly supported the idea, and Arthur promised to take the lead. It would be a place of healing, for the horses and for the people who came to learn and help. As the first plans were drawn up, it was Thunder, whose recovery symbolized new beginnings and forgiveness, who stood at the heart of it all. Arthur knew he never wanted to be the person he once was. He had learned that true greatness lay not in possessions or pride, but in the ability to admit mistakes and work on oneself. And so, a new chapter began, not just for Thunder, but for Arthur as well. A chapter built on responsibility, compassion, and genuine growth. A year had passed since Arthur had fundamentally changed his life. The stables were no longer just a place of competition and prestige, but had become a center for abused and traumatized horses. Together with Joan, Miguel, and Francisco, Arthur had launched a project that offered horses a second chance. Thunder, once the embodiment of suffering and mistreatment, had fully recovered and become a symbol of hope. He helped the newly arrived horses adjust to their new environment, exuding a calming presence. Arthur himself was proud of the stallion, who not only represented his own story of overcoming, but also inspired other animals. One day, Miguel came into the office with a serious expression. Arthur, you should see the news. Confused, Arthur turned on the TV and saw the headline, Ricardo Mendez arrested for illegal horse racing and abuse. The image showed Ricardo in handcuffs as police searched his estate. The reporter explained that several abused horses had been seized and evidence of doping had been found. Arthur's stomach churned. He remembered how he had once been part of that world, viewing horses as mere tools. The realization hit him like a blow. He could easily have been in Ricardo's place if Thunder hadn't taught him a lesson. "What do we do now?" Miguel asked quietly. "We help the horses," Arthur replied firmly, "no matter what it takes." Together with Joan and Dr. Martinez, he organized a rescue team to bring the animals safely to the center. The weakened and traumatized horses were immediately examined and cared for. Arthur personally tended to each one, speaking soothingly and promising them they were safe. Francisco visited later and observed the rescued horses with a serious expression. "You made the right decision," he said quietly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you." The following weeks were challenging, but with every small progress the rescued horses made, Arthur's conviction grew that he was on the right path. He had not only saved Thunder, but also himself, from a life of arrogance and selfishness to one of compassion and responsibility. At the opening of the expanded center, Arthur gave a speech to the numerous guests and supporters. He spoke about his mistakes, his guilt, and the lessons Thunder had taught him. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to realize what truly matters," he said with a firm voice. "This center isn't just a new beginning for the horses, but also for people willing to admit their mistakes and change." Thunder stood calmly beside him, as if understanding every word. At the end of the speech, thunderous applause broke out, and Arthur saw tears in the eyes of some attendees, including his father's. In the following months, the center flourished. People from near and far came to help or learn about rehabilitating traumatized horses. Arthur, now mature and responsible, devoted himself wholeheartedly to his work. It was a life full of meaning, a life he could never have imagined before. As the sun set behind the hills, Arthur stroked Thunder's mane. "We made it," he whispered. Thunder snorted softly and rested his head on Arthur's shoulder, a sign of forgiveness. Arthur knew his path of remorse had led to a new beginning. Together, they would fight to ensure no horse would ever suffer such pain again. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks to our valued viewers, we continue to improve every day. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up.